Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. We're going to be starting this webinar in like 2 minutes. Thank you. Hi everyone again, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We're gonna get this webinar started, and we are very excited to have this first webinar on the strategic value of human-centered design for financial institutions in emerging markets. And to have today Mark Hicks from CX Partners that is gonna lead this webinar for us today. This is a part one of a series of 2 webinars, so we're gonna have another webinar coming up soon as the second part for this webinar, and that's going to be in June. You can please let us know if you have any problems technically, or if you're not really trying to get in but you cannot get in. So please email or Skype my colleague Lynn. Here is the email and her Skype. So please feel free to reach out. I just want to introduce Mark, and I don't want to take much more time from his presentation, and I know everyone wants to hear the presentation much more. But Mark, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for doing this webinar. So Mark has been fusing psychology training and engineering design experiences. Mark has worked in human-centric design since the late 20th century. In the early 2000s, he brought safety critical design experience with systems such as plane, boat, trains, cars, and diving into small and mass market online systems in the investment and retail banking, consumer finance, and also e-commerce services delivered across a range of channels. He has spent several years directing the online product strategies for SMEs as well as multinational and also several startups. So in these roles, he complemented and extended his experience in designing skill set and brought new perspective to his understanding of successful design. Today, he applies system thinking to solve design challenges in financial services, and he believes it's critical to merge physical, emotional, and social factors with digital for anything to work sustainably. So thank you, Mark, for being here. And I will lead it up to you to start this webinar today. I just want to tell everyone that we're going to do the Q&A session in the end of the presentation. So we'll have like 10 to 15 minutes to get any questions answered. So please, if you have questions throughout, you can also write to the box with questions and I'll take them in the end in the Q&A section. So Mark, I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lynn. And welcome everybody. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you find the next 35 or 40 minutes engaging and informative. As it was mentioned, I'll be giving a couple of talks, and I'm going to mention what will be in those in a second. But first of all, let me just say that human-centered design is actually a discipline that's been emerging for not just the last 5 or 10 years, which may be when you may have become aware of this, but actually over the last 30 or 40 years. And just to frame the concept of human-centered design, I want to let you know that it was largely led by the recognition back at the late mid-20th century that design of safety-critical products, services, and systems would benefit from taking into account the needs of way than simply guessing, or being inspired by the aesthetic design. So up to that point, individuals had largely had to adapt to whatever they were given. And what they were given were typically defined by engineers who took technology as the starting point for system design, not the needs of their users. But of course, as we all know, systems became very complex from sort of the 60s and 70s onwards, and of course we live with immense complexity today. And as systems became more complex, users started to make mistakes, found them very hard to understand how to use, and it became time to find another way. So today, experience design, human-centered design, service design are all names really for a human-centered design approach. And they're all variants, and they cover now from the minutiae of what an organization delivers its products and its propositions, to how it delivers it, its journeys, and how it's structured. Customers are always the focus of human-centered design, but the needs and know-how of employees are usually taken into account because they're critical in the delivery of the proposition. HCD, or human-centered design, is an applied discipline. My background, as Alex mentioned, is actually multidisciplinary. I've had background in psychology, engineering, design, and business. And that's not an unusual mix for a human-centered designer. It's a very multidisciplinary approach, and actually that's where the value lies, at the intersection of all these disciplines. Let me just talk very, very briefly about the company I work for. So we've been established for 15 years. We work throughout the world. We have a dedicated financial services team, and we have a multi-sector team. And these days, as you'll know, as financial services specialists, that trends outside financial services are very much informing financial services. So it's important we bring these two things together. I work with clients from large institutions to very small across the world, and commercial, public, and third sector. And recently been working with CapPlus in Central Asia. Over these two talks, I'm going to talk about human-centered design, what it is, where it comes from, and how we use it, and what the value it can bring to financial services institutions in emerging economies, and how it's different to other sorts of interventions. But the first talk I'm doing today is what it is and what it can deliver. And next week, or in a couple of weeks' time rather, I'll talk about how we do it and how you can do some of it yourself. And I think that's really important to understand. It's really, human-centered design is really a business problem-solving methodology. It's a way of thinking about and solving problems, and it is accompanied by a toolbox of techniques and methods to do this. So the talk today is going to be broken into 4 parts. How human-centered design solves business problems, how it's different from other approaches that you may be more familiar with. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into digital, because digital often comes up as both a challenge for organizations today, and I'm sure there are challenges for you, but also it's never really clear what people are talking about when they talk about digital. And I just want to unpack that a little bit. I think it'll be a good foundation for the rest of this week, today, and also for the talk I give in a couple of weeks' time. And then I'll give a couple of examples of where human-centered design has been applied successfully and has delivered really measurable business results. So this title slide says human-centered design solves business problems. But really what I want to say is that there's often some confusion between human-centered design, marketing, and other approaches. And really, if I had to choose one phrase, I guess, to try and nail the difference, it's that human-centered design creates intelligent change. It does this by making things people want and need, and designing the journeys that let them get access to those services and products. What it doesn't do is make people want things. So it's not about making people want things, it's about understanding their needs and their requirements and designing things, products, propositions, services that are useful to them and helping them get access to them through well-crafted and well-designed journeys. Sometimes simply finding and removing the friction in a customer journey can do that. For example, simplifying procedures and paperwork can transform a business. At other times, a more wholesale rethink of the customer proposition may be necessary. And you yourselves, I'm sure, will be very aware of how there are hurdles in the way people access your business, be it through digital, be it through human channels, be it through telephony. All these issues are the legitimate problem-solving space of human-centered design. So, your business people, and these are challenges you may recognize. They're also challenges that we would expect to deliver solutions to through human-centered design. So, typically we're approached with these questions, which is that I have a problem with customer employee retention. Customers seem to be leaving. Their churn rate, by which I mean the duration in which they stay with us, is very high, and typically accompanying that, my employees aren't staying with me for very long. Likewise, people come to us and ask us, how can I take cost out of my business? I need to save costs, I need to streamline. And on the other hand, I want to avoid costs in the future as I grow. How do I grow from the core? This can be a real challenge for companies who have to innovate to keep abreast of the competition and have to find relevant and legitimate services and propositions for them to develop, rather than developing a diverse set of propositions which have nothing to do with core business. So growing from the core is a challenge that we help companies solve. Also, how do we diversify appropriately? There's quite a lot of diversification going on in financial services at the moment, but how do you diversify appropriately? And how do you find opportunities to serve your customers better, not just through your main proposition, but through aligned diverse propositions? How do I grow the market? That's a really interesting question, actually, we get, and that human-centered design can help you solve, and that's all about, I have a market that I understand, but I want to now serve underserved parts of that market. In other words, actually grow the market. How do I do that? How do I grow market share? That's a standard proposition requirement. How do I maintain relevance in a changing context where society is changing, technology is changing, and competition is changing? And again, just to answer that, how do I maintain this competitiveness? So HTCD tackles these, relentlessly focusing on what's good for the customer and what's good for the employee and good for the organization. And actually, as I said, that concern for a customer journey, it might be something more substantial. But by putting customers, employees first in achieving great business outcomes, we avoid a number of traps that you may recognize. One of those I will call the trap fascination with expensive and potentially irrelevant technologies. It is always the case that it's easy to trap thinking, the reason why I can't grow, the reason I can't innovate, the reason why I have no market share is because I haven't got the money to buy or invest in new technology. But actually that's so often not the case. If you focus on customers and focus on it, tech will be part of the answer, but it doesn't drive your thinking. When you start talking and working with customers, you find there are many much more solutions that can deliver great business outcomes than just investing in technology. Having said that, by focusing on customers, you can avoid the trap of being fascinated by expensive technology. And there's always lots of infrastructure out there who want to sell you latest content management system, latest customer retention system. But by focusing on what customers want and what customers need, you use traps and make the correct decision. There's a load of managed organizational fads out there. How do you choose between those? Well, if you engage with just the management organizational fads, it's very hard to know which ones are right. But if you start with the customer and work up, it becomes more apparent which is appropriate. You need to avoid, and we need to avoid, marketing hype. It's quite easy to get on board with a marketing campaign that's telling us what they need, but that doesn't always work, often doesn't, unless it's actually need. So by the customer and the employee, you can get
Mark?
cut through. Yes, hello.
We're getting a bit of breakdowns, so maybe just repeat the last two sentences that you said. I think there was not a stable connection.
Okay, I can see the connection is more stable now. Thank you for that, Alice.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we can cut through the fascination in expensive technologies. We can cut through managed and organizational fads, cut through marketing hype, and cut through the kind of helplessness that an organization can feel when it's drawn to focus overly on its books, its commercials, and not on its propositions. So, you'll probably recognize those as problems, and they're all problems that human-centered design can help you solve. So, let's talk about specific SME challenges. So, the SMEs I work with, both in emerging economies and in more developed economies, are typically characterized by the same kind of problems. They have smaller budgets. Their people overheads tend to be high. They have trouble responding to changing business context and competition. It's very hard to know what the priorities should be for the company, particularly when you get to a point where you need to grow quickly. And there are changing customer expectations. There's always changing customer expectations. So let's go back to sales. Let's go back to the smaller budgets. Salesforce, you may know Salesforce, may be the answer, but it's much more likely that a leaner, possibly even a shareware technology is better. And recently I've been working with an organization that didn't know where to go in terms of technology. And we were able to help them work out that actually available freeware technology with their needs rather than investing in expensive off-the-shelf commercial technology. So lean, people costs are high, people are always high, and achieving more efficiency and effectiveness can be achieved by understanding how they work and how to do their jobs better. Mounting external competition. Well, in emerging economies, I believe that's a big issue, especially where there are or better rivals moving, maybe companies with less scrupulous social agendas. And when it comes to priorities, it can be difficult to know what to do and what to fix. My audio has just slightly failed again, but I'll carry on. So, prioritizing a roadmap can be achieved. Look closely at what customers want. Changing customer expectations as well. In the face of changing contexts and other trends, particularly personal technologies, can be assisted by understanding what people do and what people need. Okay, well, hopefully you can hear me now. So there are specific challenges in emerging economies. Firstly, achieving rapid impact. It's really important that actually you can deploy impact quickly. Investment needs to be returned quickly. Finding the right opportunities can be very good in emerging economies as well, specifically where there are to be so many problems to solve, and it is limited. Again, prioritizing the roadmap. Finding solutions, by which I mean solutions that don't require you to constantly keep investing, solutions that don't require you continually being assisted by external consultants. And that leaves me finally the need to learn, to adopt, and to practice. So, let me a little bit about what human-centered design do. What they do is they understand people. That's the first thing they do. They understand the way they think, the way they behave, and they recognize that actually people are more complex than perhaps can be assumed if you just take a rational approach to the way people behave. People are rational, and understanding that irrationality is so important in designing effective systems to support them. Uncovering needs, understanding emotional factors, understanding technology, business, organizations, a sector, very important to understand a sector. There are specific needs and requirements in the financial services sector. Understanding the way people relate to money and their relationship with it is very important. Understanding culture and designing integrated solutions with all this information is the job of human-centered design specialist. So how does human-centered design feel different? If you employ a human-centered design approach, what will you notice? It will be different perhaps to employing an accounting-led intervention or a marketing-led intervention or a technology-led intervention. Well, in a recent engagement, I asked my customer if this was the sort of thing they had expected on day 2. I was abroad, I've been running workshops for a couple of days and talking to lots of people, and I said, is this the kind of thing you'd expected? And I was told that they were delighted, because it was the first time consultants had come into their organization and actually asked them about what they do, what their customers want, and about the whole business. And that was delightful to hear that, because that is precisely what human-centered design is about. So it's a whole system approach. And here I put up a sort of solar system description, which shows some of the points that you'd expect to find when you start working in a human-centered design capacity. You'll find, first of all, that the senior stakeholders in the business will be talked to one-to-one, not in groups, but one-to-one, to understand their aspirations for the business and the business context. So important, because people running the business often have a vision that is not aligned with those people delivering the business. It's not they don't want the same things, it's just one have a much more pragmatic, on-the-ground view of how to achieve it. So senior business interviews are key, but also working closely with the people who have to deliver the business, the frontline staff, the people who touch the customers, who have all the touch points with the customers. That might be telephony, it might be in a branch, it might be out in the field, visiting people's homes. Whatever it is, they're absolutely key to understanding how to deliver better experiences to customers and to employees. They actually hold the intellectual capital of the business. And of course, familiarization research. This is all business research, and familiarization research is to ensure that the human-centered designer are not just coming in to design systems with the information we get during the study. It's also so we understand the context and we understand the business. And typically we hold a thing called a research amnesty, where we bring all the information that the business has that is relevant to the job in hand and the challenge in hand, and we absorb it and ingest it. So we utterly understand the business, and that's so important. But we also do customer research, and that's also understanding what they know about customers,
Mark?
getting out to where they are, and also then getting. Yeah, hello. Are we back?
There was like a 10
Hello.
seconds. Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah,
Okay,
sorry.
it was a 10 seconds complete silence, so probably we missed some part.
Okay. All right. I'm afraid I can see an internet issue, ironically. Okay, so skipping forward, it's a whole system approach, and we tackle all the relevant parts of the business. We spend time with customers and with everyone in the business who touches customers. Different experience for you if you're working in human-centered design also. We design for real people, and that's really important. People often, or rather customers, companies often design for a theoretical real person. But in human-centered design, we know that people and society and economies need organized financial services, but we all have many financial services products confused. They often don't wholly understand what they're buying, others need it. Many find the air uninteresting. These are real people, and from research in this area, most people want from finance is three basic things. Simplicity, in other words, they want simple propositions they understand the value of. They want transparency, they want to feel they're being dealt with fair in a comprehensible way. And they want assurance, making the right decision, or that they are able to make the right decisions. These are the three things that people want, and that's what they need to be delivered if they are to be engaged in financial service. There are three more aspirational objectives that people want. One is they want conversation. They want relevant and dialogue with the financial services institution. They want it to be friendly and discursive. If they can get it, they want personalization, although that is a requirement that needs typically higher levels of technology. But personalization, so they're getting a proposition for one, and they want proactivity. For example, typically in Europe, it has been the case in the past that when you're going into overdraft in your current account, you weren't told you're going into overdraft. This is a really good example where customers want banks to be more proactive. And now, today, Banks in the UK and in Europe tell customers when they are approaching overdraft situations, and that is a proactive level of engagement. It's a very simple example, but it's so important for real people. So that's one thing you'll notice, is that human-centered designers will get close to your customers, really close. They'll segment them, they'll work with you to work out who exactly you want to speak to through your products and propositions, and they will align your products and propositions with those people and their needs. It's much more in depth than just asking straightforward questions. It's more in depth than running a focus group. It has to be very much a one-to-one proposition. You will also notice that it's a highly collaborative approach with customers. We actually get customers in to work with us. In this, you can see this, it's a couple of customers here, actually helping to define their own products, services, and define the journeys by which. Now, this is quite a radical approach for many organisations, actually getting the people who are going to benefit from your products and propositions in to help you do the design. But it's a very enlightened approach, and it produces extremely effective, insightful, and targeted journeys and propositions. I have to also say it has a huge benefit to the organisation, because actually by bringing customers into the organisation to work with your staff, staff's understanding of your increases immensely. Of course, it's very collaborative with staff as well. So I mentioned earlier on, we engage senior members of staff and delivery members of staff, at all the key people in the organisation, or elements of the key people in the organisation, to help us define and identify opportunities to reduce customer friction in journeys and produce more relevant products and propositions. And again, engaging staff all at the same time in workshops and in design workshops particularly is incredibly good for everybody in the organisation. It makes them feel engaged. It also means that locked up in your organisation, as I mentioned earlier, are intellectual capital all over the place. This approach allows people to speak up, and we enable them to speak up and get their views out. So you would notice a difference in terms of collaboration with staff. I think also one thing that's worth mentioning is that part of the ethos of human-centered design is to produce prototypes, not just reporting. So we very quickly try and produce prototypes of what we think or what we believe on the basis of the work we've done will be useful to customers and to the organisation. And so, for example, prototyping might not be digital. It might be paper, it might be digital, it might be a new branch, it might be a new way of talking to customers. Prototypes are just things that you think can add business value, or we think can add business value, that we simulate and we test. But we produce reports as well, and they can be extremely useful and insightful. But the process of designing experience is based on prototype. We also understand changing business contexts. So the world around us is changing in a way that is absolutely prioritising the customer, not only in financial services, but the battle these days in financial services, particularly in Europe and in the US, is being fought over the customer experience. So it's so important to understand what's going on in the wider world. Banking, for example, is changing. It's being disrupted and unbundled, by which I mean that small startups and challenges are stripping apart those parts of big institutional organisations and doing them much, much better. This is a great opportunity for small organisations actually to eat the big organisations' lunch, but also it's a great opportunity to rethink what it is customers want. And the thing that characterises all those organisations, taking that understanding, we then can move to designing experiences to support change, because change is what we're talking about here. It's getting the end experience right that we're interested in, but once this is established, we will work out how to get there. And there's 3 little phone mock-ups here, which actually are quite radical little devices that show you that technology and understanding people's needs is being brought to bear upon anticipating lifestyle issues that provide more value to customers in finance. And so we're talking about helping people save. We're talking about helping people budget. We're helping people anticipate how their spending patterns could be improved, these kind of things. But this is the very far end or front end of technology, but it's based upon understanding customer needs. Finally, we design organizations to deliver experiences because most organizations often aren't ready to deliver to their roadmap of customer priorities, and some transformation is often necessary. And so, for example, working with businesses recently, we identified that the organization needed to devolve decision-making to the frontline staff in organizations to produce more effective and efficient commercial outcomes. And actually, the interesting thing about this was that the client hadn't thought about that as being a way forward. And actually, this will release so much value for the organization when it takes place, because it stops locking up intellectual capital and know-how at the center of the organization and distributes it out to staff working with customers out at the front line. But in so doing, it also gives them an empowerment that makes their work much more valuable to them. It gives them discretion and decision-making power. And today, these things are recognized as the things that make efficient organizations work well and adaptably. I won't dwell too much on this, but you probably are all working in regulated environments. And the regulator can be a difficult beast to manage. But human-centered design allows you to manage the regulator and commercial. And that's something that I may expand in my second talk a little bit more. But working with regulators, bringing them into the process very early on with your customers and your staff is a great way of anticipating how to produce compliant products and services. And finally, actionable products and services are important. So what you're looking at here is a typical output from one of the outputs from a customer discovery or a discovery exercise, whereby we've produced insight and mapped it onto an experience map. Now, this really is a customer journey that runs from left to right, but we've identified pain points, opportunities, challenges, fixes, and this is a strategic asset for an organization that, when handed over, allows the organization to work with this over a period of 6 months to a year to prioritize the opportunity to deliver a better business for customers and employees. So human-centered design is ultimately a very actionable discipline. It identifies what the company needs to do next and gives the company solutions to make decisions about. I'm going to move on in the last 10 minutes, really, to move on to thinking about digital. Now, digital is a phrase that is often bandied about. It's not purely the outcome of human-centered design by any chance. As I mentioned earlier on, human-centered design can deliver paper, it can deliver customer-centric products such as digital solutions. It can help you develop your branch. It can help you determine the nature of the interaction with your perhaps your staff who are out in the field with customers. But it often comes back to digital because the world is becoming more digital, and digital is frequently an opportunity that we're asked to help customers solve. So I think thinking about where you are in digital is important, and hopefully from the 4 examples I'm about to give, you will be able to identify some kind of way of thinking about your business and your business needs through this digital lens. So let's take a traditional pre-digital bank as an example. This is a bank with books and ledgers where people record deposits and payments. Pens are used to make changes and enter these details. And the question is, how can this bank become a paperless organization? Well, it can be done by digitizing paper processes. This is business as usual, but in a more digital way. And so I'm going to call this level of digital intervention digitizing processes. That might be what your organization needs and wants. It's efficient, it brings everything into one place, but it is the first step towards a digital transformation. Let's take that same example of a traditional bank, but it's been through the digital process upgrade. And now it has a legacy computer in each branch. It also has an ATM. And the question is, how can digital enable the bank to become more effective and more efficient and gain a whole bank view? Well, the answer is to upgrade the old systems, like, for example, CRM, payments, reconciliation, accounting, and the overall book. Let's also automate the telefunctions through an ATM to give the customer choice and out-of-hours access. So now we're bringing another level of digital in. We're going to create a basic digital infrastructure. So the bank is now starting to work as a digital organization and all the benefits that brings. So I'm calling this, we're building a basic digital infrastructure. Now, up till now, we've been building this on the basis of employee and business needs. We're also bearing in mind the customers, because the customers will be benefiting from this. But actually now we're going to cross the divide and start looking at how do we take that digital transformation out to customers. So at this level, we call it digital customer touchpoint integration. I know it's a long phrase, apologies, but at this level, systems are interconnected and maintained, and telefunctions are digitized as ATMs. So the question is, can we build on internal streamlining and efficiencies to enhance the customer experience? In other words, can we take all the work we've done in those first two steps and start delivering that value directly to customers? Well, yeah, connected systems make it possible to interface processes with customers' devices. And of course, it's all about mobile, it's all about online, particularly in developed economies at the moment. And customers are able to use mobile apps and webs to access banking services, and mobile payments are enabled. Omni-channel plays in mobile, digital, automated telephony. In other words, there's a real channel strategy that is delivering what the customer needs in the way the customer wants it, but also delivering cost-saving efficiencies to the bank. So this level of digital integration is quite sophisticated, but what it's doing is starting to take the digital advantages of the bank out to customers. And the bank is starting to embrace an appropriate digital operating model, and not all services are digital. And driving this development at this level is very much a relentless understanding of customer needs and wants. There is no point in investing in this unless you are meeting a customer need. Otherwise, it's literally money wasted. And finally, I'm going to call the fourth level customer-centric innovation. And we see this quite a lot going on at the moment. This is actually spreading throughout the world rapidly. But so we now have a bank that's efficient, digitally connected, and gives customers choice in how to access the bank. The battle for competition is centered on the customer experience. But the question is how to evolve traditional banking services to respond to changing expectations. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, changing expectations are often led by expectations in other sectors, like in retail, where people expect experience of financial services to be seamless, to be connected, and to be delightful, a bit like the phone in your pocket. So the answer here is to start using data, and to start using what I'll call smarts, which are basic algorithmic-based technologies that allow personalization through automation. These can strategically manage client conversations across channels. They use things like biometric authentication to achieve friction-free customer journeys, and they aim to deliver utility, convenience, and delight. And as you'll understand, at this level, it's as critical as at the last level to be completely clear about what you're delivering to your customers and why, and that you are delivering to needs. So open banking is an issue in Europe at the moment. I say it's an issue, it's a fantastic opportunity to deliver these kind of innovations to customers. Open banking is spreading throughout the world as a concept. It may be something you're dealing with. It's a revolution in what it is to be a financial services organization. And again, this is a conversation perhaps for later. Right, so I'm going to just, in the last few minutes, just take a few examples of where this has been applied, just to give you a sense of how human-centered design can deliver in some real examples, or has delivered real examples. The first one I'm going to take is digitizing processes. And in this example, this first example, I'm going to talk about an international insurance and wealth company, currently we've been working with, that have benefited from literally digitizing processes, but in a major way. So their question to us was, How do we flatten a document mountain? They had a mountain of 600 documents describing 20 products. That is a problem. Nobody could navigate it or knew which ones to use. Costs to maintain it and reprint them were high. Documents went out of date. Regulatory material came in that wasn't updated. Interest rates changed and weren't accommodated. It was causing huge problems, but nobody knew what to do. And accidental mis-selling was a potential hazard. That's a real issue, obviously. So the challenge was, how do I identify which ones are useful? That's what the client wanted us to do, rewrite them clearly using compelling illustrations. We reframed it for them and said, you know, this mountain of documents is probably symptomatic of a bigger problem. Let's look at why these documents are being created and how to better manage that process. So what we did is instead, rather than rewriting them, we mapped a whole workflow that would radically optimize the content creation process. By which I mean, we looked at the problem and we identified it was an organizational problem. The problem was that anybody in the organization could commission documents without talking either to the people who had to use them, to the people who they were designed for, or to other parts of the organization. We looked at the workflow and we redesigned the workflow to make it efficient and effective. We then prototyped some ideas about how documents could be used in the future and how they could be developed with the key users of these documents, intermediaries actually. And what we were looking at here is using available personal technologies to deliver digital documents rather than a mounted printing document, a mountain of printed documents. And actually, we found that people would much rather use a tablet, for example, than have to search through 20 or 30 documents. We managed over a period of time to reduce that document mounting significantly. Because in developing this technology I've just shown you on the right, we were able to create custom documents for advisors, literally used and developed just before the point of use. It was initially built for use on iPads, extended it to desktops. This changed the way this business does its business, reduced the document mountain, and is saving them a significant money whilst delivering a much better customer experience to their advisors with hugely reduced costs and a more effective sales process. So that's an example of the entry level. Second example I'm going to use in the next couple of minutes concerns retaining customers and building competition, building growth where competition gets tough. So we were asked by an Asian MF operating in an increasingly market to who needed to differentiate, remain profitable, and retain clients and employees, improve their service, but they also wanted to grow. They were keen to adopt a customer-centric approach to tackle this challenge. We recognized it was important to understand the service, product portfolio, customer and employer experience, and product distribution. We actually didn't know until we arrived precisely how that would work and how the problem would fall. What we did is we applied a full discovery approach to it. In other words, we did all those components I mentioned earlier on, which is we spoke to the business, we spoke to stakeholders, we spoke to customers, we spoke to frontline staff, we work, and I should mention this, watching people, talking to them while they're working, talking to customers while they're working, so important. Observation is a powerful driver of insight because people are often unable to articulate why they do things. So, we apply a full broad service methodology, you see in the top left. We looked at the customer journeys, and there's an example of a deliverable, but translated to into Russian. It describes customer journey pain points, opportunities to inform them. Obviously, it's the deliverable. Created through employee and customer insight and observation, and it specifies improvements. And finally, we looked at how to design the organization to better deliver these experiences. And that is an organizational change strategy that can be adopted to transition the organization to become more effective, more efficient, and more customer-centric. So, working in collaboration with the Central MFI, we rapidly audited the quality of their customer and employee experience, tapped into the intellectual capital of the company, identified how to deliver change. We were also able to leave having given some understanding of how to progress this approach, left a box, and I talk about conceptual toolbox of tools and methods that the organization were able to deploy to help them develop a prioritized roadmap, so important, that allowed them to focus exactly what it was that next would deliver the best value to them and their customers. And from this work, they have since developed an 18-month roadmap, which they are now working towards. And all these initiatives have been achieved by relentlessly focusing on the customer and focusing on the staff, in fact, focusing on all the human components of the system. It's not that we don't look at technology, it's not that we don't look at business, we very much do so. But with an understanding of customer needs at the forefront of our problem solving, we then layer in technology, business, and other outcomes later. So I hope I've given you an idea of potential, some of the ways we approach this. I hope the audio hasn't been too problematic all the way through. But I'm going to hand back now. And if you have any questions, please send them through.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this great presentation. And sorry to anyone that experienced some ups and downs in the voice. I tried to intervene when that happened, but I know sometimes different people would feel the loss of voice in different moments. So sorry about that. Technology sometimes is our friend, sometimes not. But please feel free to send your questions. You can write them in our little question box, and I am going to present them to Mark, and we can tackle them one by one. I know there was a lot of information shared by Mark, and probably you will have a couple of questions. So please write them down, and I'll take them one by one. Mark, did you have anything to add in the end, just before we start the questions or before they start coming in?
I think the one of the questions around human-centered design is when compared to other forms of approach, so say a technology approach or a more commercial business accounting approach. So how long does a typical human-centered design intervention take? Well, of course, it depends on the nature of the problem that's being asked. But typically, we believe that we can undertake, or human-centered designers are able to undertake, a discovery process within sort of 4 to 6 weeks. And that's getting into the field, understanding what's going on, forming a view, and then embodying that view in a set of strategic assets that the organization is able to take away and work with. I think that's a realistic timescale, but I think that it's also the case that that the difference perhaps between working with organizations in Europe, for example, in North America, and organizations elsewhere can be that, of course, in Europe, where human-centered design is perhaps more established, organizations are able to take advantage of human-centered design expertise much more readily, perhaps, than in areas where it's less established. It's important, working in emerging economies, to share a toolbox that can be used by the organization itself.
Great, thank you. I got some questions, so I'll start tackling them. So how do you manage FIs that have institutionalized top-bottom approach in integrating this model?
How do I manage what? Sorry, because I missed that.
How do you manage a financial institution that have institutionalized a top-bottom approach in integrating this model, where there is no or minimal staff customer consultation?
That's a really, really good question. So firstly, the organization have to embrace the need to change, and in so doing, they are acknowledging that they are open to the idea of doing things in different ways. What we typically do, though, is we start working with very senior stakeholders to understand their vision for the business, and then we open it up to a wider audience of people who are delivering the service. And what we find rather, is that there is often a difference between what the very senior stakeholders in the business and those people who have to deliver them actually feel is possible and also want. And in so doing, in capturing all this information, we embody it and present it back to the organisation as an opportunity for change. So if you can imagine, those people who work on the ground understand what can be delivered practically. Those people who perhaps are at the very top of the organisation, if it's very hierarchical, know where they want to get to. The real power is in fusing these two points of view. And when we fuse those 2 points of view, we are able to present something back to the whole business that can be a powerful agenda for change. I think that's probably, in front of that sits the fact that human-centered designers tend to be very skilled at working in situations such as this, very skilled at working with people, and very skilled at bringing the agenda to the forefront. So it's part of the process, and the process is one of discussion and insight.
Great, thank you, Mark. Another question is...
Can I add one thing? Can I add one thing to that?
Sure,
Sorry,
sure.
one more thing I should say. Yeah, one more thing. So one of the things we do typically is we get customers into a laboratory setting, or in other words, a room that we have video cameras, etc. in, and we get them to work or to discuss products and services. And we typically link up in video. We provide video streaming to senior members of the organisation so they can see what their customers are saying. And I have to say, this is the most extraordinary transformational event for many senior stakeholders who have never actually seen customers talking about or trying to work with their products and services. And at that point, they absolutely get the need to change. So sorry, I should have added that, because it can be quite extraordinary watching that happen.
Yeah, thank you. So actually, this other question kind of maybe relates to your last point somehow. So the question is how open are financial institutions to basically let you in, see kind of their open books, their pain points, all their problems, and how open are the executives, like the higher level, to listen to basically the front level, like the loan officers or like the people that are in the branches, and take that into consideration to change. So maybe that is more of an issue if we're talking in emerging markets and where more hierarchical structures exist than if we're talking about Europe or the US. But I think, I mean, it should be like, I don't know, what is your experience with that?
Okay, well, that is how do we build trust? I think perhaps might be the underlying part of that question. How do we build trust in the senior members of the organisation and throughout the organisation? Well, the first thing we do is we assure everybody that the information they share with us is confidential, and that it won't be shared in any other way other than anonymously. In other words, it can't be attributed any other part of the organisation. The second thing is that we are interested in what individuals say, but actually what we are looking for are fundamental consistencies in patterns of information that we hear throughout the business. So very quickly, what an individual says becomes part of what individuals say. So I suppose that's the first thing, is we lead with the promise of confidentiality and anonymity. The second thing is that we're good at working with senior executives, and we're good at working with people who have to deliver the service. We're human-centered designers are nothing if not human. They are engaged and enjoy gaining insight into people's lives and people's needs. And because of this, they tend to be quite skilled interviewers. A big skilled interviewer is around building trust. So I think those two things really. One is the assertion that information will remain confidential and anonymous. And the second thing is just the skill of doing the job, of being good at talking to people and of uncovering their needs and creating rapport. There can be issues where people are uncomfortable about talking in front of other people, and we know this and we engineer situations so that doesn't happen. It can be the case that people are very uncomfortable about talking in front of their bosses, but we don't ask them to do that. So we're sensitive to this. And I think understanding a culture is important, because cultures do differ. And in some cultures, it's much more okay to say what you think in a way that's constructively critical, and in others it's not. So I think being culturally sensitive is a key component of effective human-centered design.
Great, thank you. The next question is about, you talked about your experience with an Asian MFI, and mostly about your experience with the US and the American market. So have you experienced, do you have more experience in working in emerging markets like in Africa or more Asia? And if so, or from your previous experience, what do you see as the current differences in this market regarding the human-centric design, and how do you think that can be increased?
Right, okay. So I may have given a rather Mark Hicks-centered view of the world. So I'm representing here not just my company and myself, but human-centered design as a specialism. And my own experience is limited to Europe, UK, outside of Europe, and a little outside of Europe, Middle East, and also a few in Central Asia. But human-centered designers are working all over the place, and in fact, the referral recently to work in Central Asia came from somebody in Africa who had experienced some journey mapping. So, yep, we're everywhere. And human-centered design is emerging in many places. So, although I don't have experience of working in Africa directly myself, I certainly know that human-centered design practitioners are working in those markets. But to your question, I suppose, around cultural issues, I think I talked about this a moment ago, but really being culturally sensitive is important. Cultural sensitivity will be one of the determinants about whether or not a solution will ultimately work. So we're good at that, and we're good at understanding difference and adapting to it. I think, let me answer put my final answer in there, which is that there are some models of what works that don't necessarily travel. So, for example, in microfinance, the group loan concept evolved in I think sub-Saharan Africa, possibly, and it is now being adopted elsewhere in the world. There's a good question about whether the assumptions and dynamics underpinning effective microfinance models that were developed in Africa do work as well in different cultures, and I think there's a good question over that. So I think each situation requires its own solution, but there are a set of solutions that can be taken off the shelf. But when they are applied out of their original context, we have to be very careful to make sure they still work. So sorry, that probably wasn't as specific an answer, perhaps as the question I hoped for, but I think that's about as specific as I can get at the moment.
Great. No, thank you very much, Mark. This is like, we're almost done with our time, so this was my actually last question. For anyone that needs that has more questions, please feel free to reach out to us or to my colleague Lynn, since you have her email also, and we'll try to get back to you. Thank you very much for attending this webinar today, and we're going to have the second part of the webinar soon. Thank you, Mark, for being with us and for this great presentation, and we'll look forward to the second part. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your days.